China-India relations have been on ice since 2020, when their troops clashed along the disputed Sino-Indian border. Tensions have continued at the political and military levels ever since, despite continued efforts to de-escalate. How have these frictions impacted India and China exchanges, especially for people with familial ties to the other country? In their new book, Rebels, Traitors, and Peacemakers, Shivaji Das and Yolanda Yu explore the love and turmoil faced by Indian-Chinese interracial relationships, which have to contest not only cultural differences and prejudices, but now also rising tensions between their governments. Is it possible that these same couples hold the answer to how to secure more peaceful relations? Welcome to the latest episode of Behind the News. I'm Shannon Tiezzi, editor-in-chief at the Diplomat, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by authors Shivaji Das and Yolanda Yu to discuss the barriers faced by Indian-Chinese couples and how growing tensions are impacting these individuals' lives. Shivaji, Yolanda, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So first, I just want to ask, what was your inspiration for the book, and how did you go about writing it?
So we were pretty much inspired by triggered by one of the incidents in Singapore, where just a random person walked up to an Indian-Chinese couple and scolding the boy and saying, "Don't take away our girl." So this person is a Chinese race, and the boy was the Indian race who was with the Chinese girlfriend. So for us, we were reflecting on our relationship that we did not experience something so, in the face, but it was indeed, doesn't mean that it doesn't happen with the other couples.
Yeah, so we wanted to explore this whole phenomena of interracial relationships, which is quite big around the world. I believe in the United States, almost 1 in 5 marriages are now interracial, similar numbers in Singapore. But within that, we wanted to frame it within the Indian-Chinese context, given that we are, as a couple, much closer to this. And we have many friends as well who belong to these two communities and are married together or separated. And they have many interesting stories that we have come to know over time. And we thought it would make sense to just explore these things, go a little deeper. Because many of the articles in Singapore newspapers or other places which talk about these relationships, Indians and Chinese, they usually focus on just the fancy clothing, the festivals, the food, but they don't really go behind into the tensions that are very real sometimes. And that's what we wanted to explore in this book as well. So in a way, the purpose of the book will be solved if we can indeed become peacemakers, as you mentioned in your introduction.
So as you mentioned, Chinese and Indian couples can face a lot of difficulties, whether from social pressure or also logistically, especially during COVID, trying to get visas to visit each other's countries. Can you describe some of the barriers that the couples in your book, and perhaps yourself as well, have had to overcome?
I can go first. So while we talk about couples who are from India and are from China, either of the individuals, we also look at these two races, not necessarily Indian citizens or Chinese citizens at this point of time. So they could be Indians who have been living in India for living in Singapore for many generations, Chinese living in Singapore for many generations, similarly in Malaysia. So the most of the conflict that comes usually happens because of the family situation. The families are the ones who are often the biggest opponents, and a lot of that could be coming from the patriarchal nature of these two societies, which are still very much deep in there. And that's the biggest factor. I mean, some of the couples that we interviewed, the girl was locked up, beaten up in gangs, followed everywhere by the family. The son was often estranged by the father. So these were the most common things that we encountered. The family perhaps is the biggest barrier. And as one of the girls said, she was Indian from Malaysia. She said that, I couldn't imagine the kind of damage families can cause.
Yeah, on the other hand, I think family could also be the most uniting factor when there are similarities where even though, both of the couples come from very different backgrounds, but both have really big families and the way they work with each other, the close ties are very similar. So when a girl goes into the guy's family and the family actually said, we couldn't ask for a better wife because she is just so naturally uniting in this kind of large families. Similarly, the other way around, that works as well.
And talking about the political background behind this, it doesn't play a big role, I would say, in terms of the personal lives of these couples, but there is a background always behind this. And there could be practical challenges for those Indian and Chinese couples who are either living in India or living in China. It is sometimes very hard to get visa. It's hard to get married, to get the certificates. They need a single certificate sometimes. It's not easy, to the extent that sometimes officials encourage them to renounce the relationship and look for someone within their own country. And then there are the technical challenges of just staying in touch, because many of the Chinese apps are banned in India. Many of the apps Indians use, they are not accessible in China. So if these two are living separately, it's just simply hard to communicate and stay in touch, which can lead to suspicions and these kind of issues. But also what we have seen is, given that there is so much of propaganda on the internet, social media that is happening from these two countries, even say Indians who have been living in Singapore for many years, Chinese who have been living in Malaysia for many, many years, they are also influenced by these propaganda of a certain kind of racial superiority. And that kind of forms an undertone in behind these relationships as well.
Yeah, so in the sense that the relationship can be really fragile. So let's say in the case when one of the partners was missing or just busy and less engaged, and then the friends and family would come up and say, maybe he has other girl, or maybe she is not that into you, maybe she's seeing other guys. So the suspicion can quickly rise because of the trust or all those undertone that Shivaji mentioned.
Now, in any interracial or interethnic marriage, there's going to be cultural differences that need to be worked through. What are some of the biggest issues that the couples you profiled in your book had to surmount in terms of making their marriage work?
I think I can name a couple of them. One is in terms of, I think both cultures have similarities in terms of, families or extended families are being important, but Chinese may have a particular way of Chinese, engaging with the families and the guys. So there are things that you kind of take as very naturally, that you want the other party to support you, and then the other one is not able to. So one example can be, for example, how son-in-laws are treated in different cultures. Like in Chinese culture, the son-in-law is like expected to be the man of the house and shoulder a lot of weight and financial responsibilities, and also the care for the elderly on day-to-day basis. Whereas in Indian context, as far as I know, some of them, they enjoy almost like a god-like status, and they are to be pampered. So that can lead to very different expectations.
And there are also things we take for granted, like food. Many Indians could be vegetarians, for instance, and they have challenges with adjusting to food. Even after they have been together for many decades, food could be an issue. In terms of cultural expectation, how you engage with the rest of the community, that could be a factor as well. But having said all of these, there are also other identities which can dominate this simple racial definitions of these two. For example, if one Chinese family is a Christian family, this Christianity could overpower the Chinese identity. And if the boy, even if he's Indian, if he is Christian, it's much easier. But if it's some other religion, this religious divide can be a big factor. So there are other identities as well, which could influence how they react or interact with each other. And what we have seen is that in places where both are minorities, say in the United States or in the UK, Canada, these kind of Australia, these kind of places where both these are minority, they tend to go together a bit more and without much of the tensions they may face when one is a majority and one is a minority. Yeah? So in Australia, for instance, many of the couples we talked to, they were saying, oh, we just love to be with another Asian person, and that's why there was natural attraction to this other person as well. So there are these interplays which are there depending on the economic background, the society they are living in, and also how long they have been away, religious factors and all that.
Now, we've talked a lot about the obstacles that need to be overcome and the difficulties in these relationships, but many of the couples that you profile are still together. These are successful relationships. So let's end on a hopeful note. What can the continued persistence of these relationships teach us about how Indian and Chinese communities, whether in third countries or India and China proper, can coexist and respect each other?
Well, there are some data showing that interracial couples have a higher divorce rate, but the anecdotal evidence with Indians and Chinese seem to be that they tend to stick longer, and the divorce rate will actually be less, even though in our book we have profiled some couples who have separated. But that's what happens, that many of these couples, when they have stayed together for many years also, they tend to attract and bring together their families, their relations, their friends in a sort of a syncretic environment, which is a future that we might want to aspire for the world as well. For instance, a Chinese father-in-law may now be very happy to dance a Bollywood dance in their festivals. They will enjoy the Indian food. And the same way, the Indian families are very welcoming to the Chinese in-laws. They love to interact despite the language differences and challenges and all that. And then over time, the views that they share is that there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of news which are adverse about these countries that we face, but they are quite sane in the sense that, yeah, we know that the reality is far more different. And when there are people-to-people interactions, always there's a lot more positive things than negative. So in a way, this message kind of comes out very strongly from these couples, and they tend to spread it out among their community, friends, families, and well. And that's the trend that we have seen. So maybe it's a small trend, but if it becomes bigger, it could lead to peaceful situation between not just these two countries, but in many other situations as well.
Yeah, and I think on that note, it's not, it's pretty similar to other interracial couples as well. So like I know Russian and Ukraine couples, or other, couples of their countries at war at the moment. And how do they cope with all this is really being able to see beyond the geopolitical tension, but really looking at as being individuals. And also, I think there is also a sense of community when we look around and say, okay, the world has become less homogeneous and more open for such relationships, and our children actually meet other mixed race children, and some of them are mixed race children of mixed race couples, and it's just how the world is moving, and we were never that homogeneous from a start.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I enjoyed talking with you about your book. I hope some of our listeners will read it because it's very insightful and a worthy read in this more increasingly diverse world. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe so you can see more episodes of Behind the News, and I hope to see you next time.